delighted to have you join us for tonight's talk by Elaine Ayers, who will discuss a really fascinating project that she undertook while under stay-at-home orders for COVID, her Quarantine Herbarium project. Elaine gave a talk when the Wagner was open to the public in person about 3 years ago about her research on Victorian women botanists, and we're really glad to welcome her back and happy to have her for a talk that's so focused on this special time. A few words about the Wagner before we start. The Wagner Free Institute of Science is a natural history museum and educational institution located in Philadelphia. Founded in 1855, our mission is public education and science, and tonight's talk is just one of many programs that we offer. And as is stated in our name, all of our programs are free of charge to make them accessible to everyone. We have a National Historic Landmark building, which if you can see the picture behind me, that's our museum, which houses a natural history museum and a library, at which is where many of our programs typically take place. While we've been closed for COVID-19, we've started to develop remote learning opportunities to make our courses and lectures like these available while everyone is at home. Tonight's talk is part of our Weeknights at the Wagner series, and we're running this through July and most likely into the fall as well. Each week we'll feature a different speaker, and next week we'll be hosting architectural historian Michael Lewis, whose talk will look at the history and development of libraries, public and private, in Philadelphia. So tonight we welcome Elaine Ayers back to the Wagner. She is a faculty member at New York University, where she teaches in the Museum Studies program. Her work focuses on the intersections of art, science, and collecting in the 18th and 19th centuries, and she is currently working on her first book, Strange Beauty, The Art and Science of Botany in the 19th Century Tropics. That's actually what she talked about at the Wagner last time. Her research has been supported by fellowships from many places, including the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine, the New York Botanical Garden, the Yale Center for British Art, and she has written about the history of botany for numerous publications, including Cabinet Magazine, Hyperallergenic, Lady Science, and the Public Domain Review. Elaine got her PhD in History of Science from Princeton, where she also got her master's while she was working at the Princeton University Art Museum.
Hi everyone, thank you so much to the Wagner for having me back. As I guess now all of you know, I gave a lecture here in 2017 and ended up meeting so many wonderful friends and colleagues through the process, and I'm just really sorry to be doing this over Zoom instead of in the Wagner's amazing 19th century lecture hall. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in today from the occupied territory of the Lenape people who have stewarded this land for generations. So what I want to do this evening is talk very briefly about a project that I just started in March, just as our shelter-in-place order went through, and which is still very much in progress. The Quarantine Herbarium began as a way of marking time during this truly strange, truly unprecedented, a word I know we're all sick of hearing, moment, but I don't think any of us expected that quarantine would go on for so long, and I certainly didn't expect how much interest there would be in this project, which now has over 300 contributions and another 150 sitting in my inbox from plant lovers around the world. I'm very excited to share what that process has been like with all of you and to speak in more detail about the historical precedent and complications of a project like this, all of which I've been thinking about for the past few months. So I'll structure this talk into three sort of broad overview sections. First, I'll describe the Quarantine Herbarium project in more detail. Then I'll discuss the historical legacy of herbaria as colonial institutions amidst the so-called professionalization of botany in the 18th and 19th centuries. And finally, I'll delve a little deeper into alternative ways of interacting with nature and forming communities and exchange networks around botany. Sometimes these are in response to exclusion, both historically and now, so that will be the focus of this talk. Because this project is still very much a work in progress, though, I welcome your input and suggestions, so I will try to save plenty of time for conversation at the end. what is the Quarantine Herbarium? Drawing on informal botanical correspondence networks in the 19th century, I conceived of this project both as a way of connecting plant lovers around the world and as a way of, for lack of a better term, keeping a personal diary of passing time during this quarantine. I, like many others I've spoken to, found myself interacting with the world around me in a radically new way this March. Quite suddenly, NYU, where I teach, announced that classes would be taught remotely for an undetermined amount of time, and very soon after, the shelter-in-place order went through, restricting my activity to, for the most part, walking my dog around the block and going on panicked mass grocery store runs every couple of weeks. I began cherishing my limited time outdoors with my dog as a much needed break from the monotony and pressures of home, taking him out to the park across the street for longer and longer walks early in the mornings. In doing this, though, I noticed a profound disconnect between what I research as a historian of science, plants in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the living plants growing in my immediate vicinity. I have, for most of my life, ignored the so-called weeds growing in the cracks of the pavement directly outside my house, many of the trees in whose shade I read in the afternoons, the grasses I play with my dog on, the innocuous white flowers blooming around my block, and the sprouts popping up in my garden that I quickly pull and discard. It's easy, too, to ignore the mosses and lichen and ash trees in downtown New York, where I work, in favor of those very same plants when spending the day hiking in the woods focused on nature. I think many of us tend to overlook the plants in our immediate environments unless they directly affect us in some way, unless we're deliberately planting them or seeking them out for some reason. I also realized while looking for a clean notebook to work from, my normal notebook was locked in my office in New York, that I actually did use to interact with plants as a way of marking time. Flipping through old notebooks that I've collected over more than 15 years, I found dozens and dozens of pressed flowers, ferns, and other plants, usually with little notes about when and where I collected them, faded purple gladiolas from the farmer's market on my last day in Madison, Wisconsin before moving to the East Coast, oak leaves from the tree that used to grow outside of my apartment in Princeton, New Jersey when I was in grad school. I had absent-mindedly saved these remnants of my life for years, mirroring the pressed plants that I found time and time again, folded into diaries, manuscripts, and books in the archives that I've worked from. The Quarantine Herbarium then began as a way of restarting that process of timekeeping while connecting to the plants growing around me, ideally with the hopes of building a very small community of plant lovers who are interested in doing the same thing. As I mentioned, I modeled this project on the botanical exchange networks of the 19th century that I study in my own work, if only to make it seem like I was doing something productive in quarantine. And this historical framework has actually proved incredibly useful to me in thinking through the roots and limitations of this project, which has in turn also provided a practical, embodied way for me to rethink this history. I kept the format and instructions of the Quarantine Herbarium as basic and open-ended as possible because the goal here was to leave it open to whatever people wanted to do with it rather than to launch some sort of citizen science project that necessitated deep involvement both in terms of time and resources. Pressing plants at its most basic level doesn't really require much skill or many materials, although you can certainly employ a great deal of skill and additional materials if you choose to, and certainly professional experts in herbarium studies do have a great deal of embodied skill here. So first and foremost, you need to collect your plants. For this project, I envisioned people taking simple cuttings from wild plants on socially distanced walks or hikes, or from plants that they've grown in their own gardens, being very careful to adhere to best basic practices in collecting. Of course, don't take plants from private property without permission, don't take plants from protected areas, and don't pull out plants by their roots, thereby killing the plants. For my first collections, I pulled up some weeds from my garden that I was pulling out anyway and cut a couple of blooming flowers from an abandoned corner lot on my block, classic Philly corner lot, that has for years now been collecting trash. I didn't know the names of these plants and had never really given them any real attention, but there was something so beautiful and maybe a little bit sad about these beautiful, delicate plants that had burst through the concrete and the garbage on my block, determined to grow and take up some quiet space. Next, and maybe most importantly, you need to record information about your specimens, to write down where you collected it and when, and at the very least, because you or I will inevitably forget and be left with unidentifiable cutting 6 weeks or 6 years later, as I found in most of my notebooks. And indeed, many, if not most, of the plant pressings that I've found between the pages of people's diaries and books from the 19th century don't include any identifying information, which in part, among many other factors, separates them from actual herbarium specimens and renders them, for better or worse, ephemera rather than scientific objects. For step 3, you'll actually press your cuttings by arranging them into the position you'd like them to stay in and layering them between sheets of absorbent paper. Newspaper works well and was used in many 19th century herbarium specimens, but you could also use blotting paper, a phone book, or tissue paper, which will also keep your plant from sticking to the page. Once it's arranged onto paper, you need to apply steady, evenly distributed, heavy pressure to the specimen, ideally through a plant press, which you can build as one contributor did, but heavy books also work. So I and many other contributors have been putting dictionaries, unused law books, and other heavy academic textbooks to good use here. Some contributors have experimented with ways of better preserving plants' color, and the herbarium curator at the Royal Botanic Gardens of Ontario, Nadia Kavalan, reached out to me to suggest silica gel as an option here. Once your specimens are stacked under pressure, you wait, which I think is the hardest part of this process. I'm not very patient. Specimens can take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks to dry out, depending on their size and water content and the temperature and humidity of your own home. So you might be faced with several check-ins to check their progress along the way. Finally, once your specimens are fully dry, you'll very, very carefully remove them from the absorbent paper you've pressed them in, maybe with tweezers if you need a finer touch, and mount them however you'd like, attached with acid-free paper tape, Elmer's glue, or a thread and needle. People have experimented with different ways of attaching them. A huge amount of skill goes into mounting herbarium specimens within professional institutions, but again, I wanted to keep this project as open-ended and approachable as possible. So contributors have mounted them in their own notebooks and diaries. They've drawn the plants alongside them. They've added notes, both practical and personal, to the page itself, and they've even designed maps to better ground their specimens in place, as in this case here. These pressings are hardly scientific in nature, and I've loved seeing how many of the contributions have come from children whose parents have helped them with the delicate parts, but have given them free reign over the setting, as in this series of specimens, which I'm especially drawn to, contributed by historian Nicole Welch-Jarger and her daughter Josephine, working from Prospect Park, Pennsylvania, which I think are just a fabulous experiment in line and color. So I had originally planned this collection to function as a quote-unquote real exchange network, as in contributors would physically send specimens in the mail to each other, but the practicalities of this became quickly apparent. I love getting things in the mail, and I was in part inspired by the brilliant historian Lydia Pine's postcard project, which has been an absolute delight to participate in under quarantine. But sending potentially bulky specimens by an overburdened USPS seemed tricky. It confined the project to very local networks, and it risked the potential of spreading invasive species, of course. Definitely not what we wanted to do. When one of my students, who I think is here tonight, received a pressed dandelion almost 6 weeks after I mailed it from Philly to New York this spring, a contribution to her own absolutely amazing project in experimenting with botanical cyanotypes, I knew that this physical exchange just was not going to work. So at the risk of losing the material delight that this project plays with, I've had contributors just take photos of their specimens and email them to me. And for lack of a better system, because I truly never thought that the project would grow this large, I've been uploading contributions much slower than I would like to a Google Drive folder, assigning each specimen a unique identification number, linked to a list of contributors. And I've also been keeping and updating a list of historical sources that have informed this project. As I'll mention at the end of this talk, I'm hoping to build an accessible and sustainable website for these specimens while bringing in new voices at the end of the summer, which will act as a more permanent record of this project. In keeping with the spirit of open-endedness, I've invited participants to be involved however they'd like to, and we've ended up with some stunning botanical illustrations accompanying pressed plants from Netherlands-based art historian Jessie Wei Swan Chen, who has since started her own participatory project focused exclusively on botanical illustration, as well as this lovely illustration of the dreaded garlic mustard from scientific artist Amber Luning. I should say here that this project is not and was never intended to be a citizen science project. It's a term that in and of itself evokes political decisions over whose expertise counts as scientific and who gets to be a citizen, of course. While many contributors have attached plant species names to their specimen sheets, sometimes with the help of plant ID apps, they're by no means necessary for this project, and we're not contributing to a larger mapping or identification project here. This should really be thought of more as an artistic method of community building and diary keeping, which seems so needed to me in this historical moment. This project has brought with it so much joy and beauty, not just in going through these incredible images of plants sent to me by participants, but in reading the stories that almost everyone attached to their contributions in their emails. People I knew, and more typically people I didn't know, told me quite intimate details about their daily lives attached to collecting and arranging these specimens, many of which stunned me in their capacity for adding one more thing, participating in this project, onto clearly confusing, heartbreaking, and sometimes terrifying times. One contributor from Canberra, Australia, told me that she had a baby in February and was spending her quarantine taking him out for daily walks in her neighborhood and had collected new eucalyptus leaves on every single one of these walks. She's binding them together into a book to give him when he's older as a way of telling him about this strange time into which he was born. Some contributors sent specimens that reflected their newly uprooted lives. First plants collected in cities they lived and worked in, and then maybe a month later, new plants collected in family hometowns where they had settled to wait out the pandemic, sometimes after losing their jobs. A number of specimens were contributed by parents and their children, suddenly faced with the impossible task of homeschooling while working with no end in sight. A few people were still going to their regular jobs deemed essential workers and were looking for relaxing meditative activity to do amidst a climate of fear and uncertainty. While some contributors work in the sciences, broadly defined, most don't, and have been interacting with nature in totally new ways during quarantine, from planting and maintaining their own gardens for the very first time, to experimenting with plant ID apps as they take socially distanced walks or try to work outdoors. Some contributors submitted a specimen or two once and then moved on to other projects, and others have sent in specimens regularly, finding the project helpful in providing some semblance of structure in their interactions with the environment. What's emerged from all of these contributions, though, is a real sense that people feel that we're living through something radically new and profoundly disorienting right now, and that we're all desperate for a way of keeping track of what's happening around us in some way. For some of us, that looks like Zoom happy hours with distant friends and families, comparing stories about how people are acting like things have gone back to normal, whatever that looks like, or what supplies have been stashed up at grocery stores. But for others, it looks like writing down what we're seeing, journaling regularly for the first time, returning to snail mail, and sending postcards and letters to each other, maybe trying to mark time with art, stability, and connection. And of course, observing nature has always been deeply connected to marking time, not just seasonally, but also in significant periods of our lives. We might associate changing leaves with going back to school, or the smell of ripe tomatoes with summertime spent with our families, or even the bare branches of winter with seasons of depression and introversion. But many of us are acutely aware of how time no longer maps easily onto these states of nature that we sometimes take for granted in this tempestuous human-driven era of climate change. It's shocking, jarring when we see cherry blossoms or daffodils emerge in the middle of February, or when endlessly wet, stormy summers, followed by weeks-long stretches of 100-degree weather, kill the veggies that should be flourishing in our temperate East Coast gardens. It feels very difficult to keep track of what should be blooming when and where now, as though nature is thoroughly misaligned with the Anthropocene epoch that we, through largely colonial systems of capitalism and plantation agriculture, have caused. But herbaria are ideal ways of tracking how climate change has driven the movement of, adaptations of, and sometimes complete decimation of plant species. Because most herbarium specimens tag where and when a plant was collected, and because these specimens range over hundreds of years and number sometimes in the millions, herbaria are excellent sources of data, not just for botanists, but for climate researchers who have been able to use specimens to uncover and make visible species extinction, how other species have survived by literally moving to cooler geographic areas, how some species have mutated and evolved to withstand the changing climate around them, complete with new ecological interactions between pollinators and predators, and so on. Herbaria then are intimately linked to timekeeping measures, both on a hyperlocal and on a global geological scale. So what is a herbarium, and how is it different from, and where does it intersect with the very old practice of pressing plants as keepsakes? The simple answer to that, even if many of the techniques and methods of pressing plants and keeping a herbarium overlap, is that the herbarium is, at its heart, a scientific institution built primarily for taxonomic purposes. As a number of historians of science have pointed out, the goal of arranging plants on paper grew out of the wide-ranging field of medical botany, and many of our earliest dried plant collections, dating to the early to mid-1500s, can be found in universities whose institutional gardens largely function for medical purposes. Dried plants were fixed into books with the purposes of examination and comparison, forming corticicus, literally dry gardens, which gradually expanded beyond medical purposes and were incorporated into the early cabinets of curiosity maintained by wealthy European men like Ulysses Aldrovandi in Bologna and John Tredescant the Elder, whose collections seated Oxford's Ashmolean Museum. But the modern herbarium, a site devoted to storing pressed plants, oftentimes separated by dried and pressed plants, pickled wet specimens, and herpetological seed collections, emerged in the mid-18th century in the context of Linnaean classification systems, as you can see here, some of his original specimens and his herbarium cabinet, and were therefore inextricable from the spread of empire. The 18th century was, at its heart, a period of information overload as naturalists and humanists struggled to develop new organizational and classificatory systems to handle the glut of quote-unquote new specimens and objects extracted from European colonies. As exotic specimens of plants, animals, minerals, and other curiosities flooded the marketplaces of Europe, naturalists strove to create standardized naming practices, both reducing the number of duplicate names for the same specimen and, on the other hand, creating an infinitely expandable system of classification that allowed for taxonomic comparison and study. Carl Linnaeus' sexual system of classification privileged specimens' external characteristics and allowed naturalists to develop two-part Latin names based on those characteristics, what we now call binomial nomenclature, recognizing that any system, including this one, was indeed artificial rather than natural, developed for a very specific set of human purposes. While the sexual system of classification, which was hotly debated and gradually replaced over the course of the 19th century for the French naturalist Antoine Laurent de Jussau's natural system, sought to, at least theoretically, expand knowledge production to anyone with a magnifying lens and Linnaeus' own table in front of them, its ramifications were profound. Now, of course, Linnaeus' taxonomic principles could easily take up a 45-minute talk on their own, so I'll sort of hold off here. But it is worth noting, especially because Linnaeus himself is still taught, often uncritically, as the father of modern taxonomy in Bio 101 classes, including one that I took in undergrad, that the system separated humans into 5 different varieties of our species: Homo americanus, Homo europeanus, Homo asiaticus, Homo africanus, and Homo monstris. And many herbaria have continued to color code their filing systems accordingly, storing American specimens in red folders, Asian specimens in yellow folders, and so on. As historians of science like Londa Schiebinger have pointed out, Linnaeus' system also privileged, perhaps unsurprisingly, male organs over female organs, a hierarchy still borne out in botanical classification today. Organizing the world into easily legible classification systems, though, was often couched in terms of the democratization of knowledge. Indeed, by the second half of the 18th century, Diderot and D'Alembert's massive collaborative encyclopédie sowed the seeds of the French Revolution while secularizing and making publicly available all of the world's knowledge, in their words. And the private collections of cabinets of curiosity owned by men like Hans Sloane, they gave way to governmentally funded institutions like the British Museum and later on London's Natural History Museum. Whether or not these collections of objects and information were truly available to all people was, of course, a matter of fierce debate, even at the time, but these shifts in ownership and access were deeply tied to questions of citizenship and the dissemination of information as part of the civilizing mission. Now, certainly the civilizing mission and the so-called democratization of knowledge focused its sights primarily on people within Europe and shouldn't be divorced from the long history of the global slave trade, still very much flourishing in the late 18th century, even as abolition movements across Europe began to call for legal strictures ending the buying, selling, and owning of people. As scholars like James Del Borgo have pointed out, early herbaria, including Hans Sloane's, intimately depended on the slave trade, profiting from the labor and expertise of enslaved peoples and simultaneously stripping these enslaved peoples' names from the record, contributing to seemingly innocuous storehouses of nature that perpetuated, in fact, extreme violence on Black and brown bodies. Truth-telling about these colonial institutions requires not just pointing out the problematic, racist, violent histories of individual naturalists, although that's certainly necessary, but also in reattributing botanical knowledge to the enslaved peoples who were forced to build new lives in new places, oftentimes bringing plants with them, and the dispossessed peoples whose land was stolen from them and transformed into the unsustainable monoculture plantations that have directly contributed to global climate change. As Judith Carney has written, enslaved Africans transported rice to the Americas along the Middle Passage, bringing with them deep generations-old knowledge about how to cultivate a crop outside of its natural environment. Similarly, both Abino Dove Aseo Asare and Blanda Schiebinger have described how African expertise in plants' healing properties contributed to, sometimes in collaboration with, and sometimes exploitatively, the development of modern medicines and pharmaceuticals within Africa and the Caribbean. In other parts of the world, growing botanical gardens like Kew in London built their collections on plantation agriculture, funding their work through forced labor even after the legal abolition of slavery, and cultivating cash crops like tea, rubber, and sisal, while experiments on transplantation, acclimatization, and shipping were carried out and facilitated by, more often than not, Black, Indigenous, and other experts of color, who worked with and for colonial botanists on expeditions and in gardens. And as ecologists are just starting to very explicitly recognize, many principles of sustainable land stewardship, from controlled burning to terraforming and crop rotation, were employed by indigenous communities across the Americas, Asia, and Africa well before the 18th century, and were deliberately stopped by colonial settlers and sometimes ridiculed in botanical writing, only to be reintroduced as somehow novel methodologies in the 20th and 21st century. In standardizing botanical classification, Linnaeus quite explicitly wrote alternative worldviews and naming systems out of the increasingly formalized book of nature. While some colonial naturalists did indeed record indigenous names, uses, and stories about the plants they extracted in writing, the centuries-long knowledge was typically seen as extraneous to the taxonomic process, and some information, as in the abortifacient properties of the Caribbean flower Phlos pavonis, were willfully ignored or erased. In many cases, it was indigenous women who held privileged knowledge about plants, often being the ones cooking or creating medicines out of their products. Much of this knowledge never made it into print, either because colonial naturalists didn't ask for it, or they didn't think it was worthy of recording, or because these women, unsurprisingly, didn't readily communicate their domestic habits to the white men inflicting violence on or encroaching on their communities. To be sure, indigenous communities across the world participated in colonial collecting, sometimes by choice and sometimes by force, and oftentimes some were uneasily in between. Indigenous experts sought out desirable plants and guided so-called armchair naturalists, sometimes recording their own information about these specimens and participating in botanical illustration, a key element of communicating scientific knowledge across long distances. More often than not, though, these experts remained unnamed and their plants were bestowed a two-part Latin name. When these experts were named, as in the case of Edmund Albius, a 12-year-old enslaved African working on the island of Réunion, who apparently single-handedly developed the first successful technique in artificially pollinating vanilla orchids, thus facilitating their cultivation with the goal of harvesting their pods, their stories have often been retold in ways that reinforce exceptionalism, playing into Eurocentric narratives of model minorities and singular teleological discoveries that privilege solitary geniuses having eureka moments. To be sure, we should speak these names when we can and work to recover their lost histories, But reifying successful individuals does run the risk of obscuring the hundreds and thousands of people whose names weren't recorded, but whose labor, skill, and knowledge were exploited all the time. And I think here we as historians have much to learn from the field of subaltern studies. Within Europe, naturalists who didn't read or write Latin easily, usually working class men and women, found themselves unable to participate in the taxonomic process, even as they continued to collect and work with the plants in their immediate environments. Working class fern specialists, for instance, could be instructed in how to find, collect, and preserve plants for the herbarium quite easily, and there are indeed a number of short guidebooks that traveled to provincial regions of Europe and overseas as part of the colonial mission, but they were increasingly excluded from the relatively formal process of authoring specimens, i.e. dissecting them, determining their morphological structures in comparison with other plants, and determining and naming their species. Indeed, natural history, a wide-ranging and inclusive field of practices based in works of description, began to specialize and professionalize in the first few decades of the 19th century, splitting off into fields that we'd recognize as separate if overlapping disciplines today: botany, zoology, entomology, geology, and so on. While the work of doing botany might look more or less the same in the 1780s as it did in the 1840s, what it meant to be a botanist had changed a great deal. And like most other fields, the title increasingly needed formal education behind it, usually through a university or graduate level degree. This process of specialization and professionalization was a complex and unsteady one, but it worked to functionally shut people who didn't have access to a university education, women, many working class men, and people of color, out of formal botanical settings, meaning that they could rarely, if ever, publish their work in an authoritative way, become members of scientific societies that promoted networking, collaboration, and funding, or have their names recorded alongside specimens, even those that they might have collected, which does give us a disproportionate view of natural history as exclusively performed or mostly performed by privileged white men, when in fact many other nameless individuals participated in the field widely. There are certainly exceptions to this professional exclusion, and botany tended to be a little more open to amateur participants, for lack of a better term, than more elite fields like comparative anatomy, especially in its more practical or economic aspects that were in many ways inextricable from horticulture and agriculture. As I noted, this is a really complex and uneven process rather than a straightforward change over time narrative. But it does mean that it can be difficult for historians to track down these so-called amateur naturalists' names or build compelling biographies of them, even though their specimens and contributions clearly occupy space in herbaria and natural history museums. While the majority of amateur botanists' names have been lost, they were either never recorded or were written out of the archives at some point along the way, we can track the private collecting and exchange practices of some of these men and women, especially when their names attracted attention for other reasons. So one obvious example of this is Emily Dickinson, whose collections you can see here. She kept an extensive herbarium beginning when she was a teenager, which is now housed at and has been very well digitized by Harvard. Dickinson's herbarium is a fairly typical example of how young women might press and arrange flowers in the mid-19th century. She collected her plants in her immediate vicinity in Amherst, Massachusetts, most of them native plants, but some of them introduced houseplants. Beautifully arranged them on sheets of paper with small strips of paper listing their Latin names attached to them, and then bound them into a single volume with 66 pages and over 400 specimens. Now, Dickinson's primary mission wasn't exclusively taxonomic. She didn't try to arrange these specimens in a particular scientific order or form a full set of a genus or take notes about when, where, or how she found them. Her book about pressed plants then blurs the definition of what a herbarium really is. It's a set of dried and labeled flora, certainly, but it isn't intended for scientific use, at least exclusively, and it erred on the side of aesthetic arrangement and at times poetic symbolism, unsurprisingly for Dickinson, bringing together the seaweeds of a coastal region for comparison and identification, as in the work of Dickinson's contemporary Margaret Gatty. Women naturalists working in the 19th century were often relegated to the role, though, of communicating science to non-expert audiences and especially to children, performing the work of popularization, again in lieu of a better term. And thinking through what these better terms should be is a really challenging and hotly debated process. Women had always participated in botany, and in 18th century Europe served as some of the strongest patrons of the field, building their gardens and hothouses by funding collectors to travel in search of new and beautiful plants. The exotic collections of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, for instance, were funded and supported in large part by the Dowager Princess Augusta of Wales, and many of you might be familiar with the botanical artist Mary Delaney's incredibly intricate cut paper collages, or as she called them, mosaics, of plants that she grew herself and that collectors sent to her in an 18th century botanical correspondence network that included some of the most famous naturalists of her day. By around the 1830s, though, women had found themselves increasingly excluded from the taxonomic and morphological work of botany, which had, in 19th century orchidologist John Lindley's words, been separated into the, quote, serious thoughts of a man and mere amusement for ladies. This amusement took the form of conversational books written for other women and children, essentially translating those serious thoughts into plainer, more accessible language, botanical illustration, and indeed Lindley himself worked very closely with a female illustrator, Sarah Drake, for most of his life, and into private personal practices, as in the case of Emily Dickinson's work. Again, there are very clear exceptions to this exclusion, and there are some notable women who participated in botanical collecting, naming, and publishing, both in Europe and in the colonial setting, oftentimes, unfortunately, directly exploiting people of color, but it was incredibly difficult for women to make a name for themselves as professional botanists in the 19th century, and near impossible for working class women or women of color. Plants, though, were still attractive and desirable objects of study for women, and many of them gardened, invested in trendy flora like ferns and orchids, and pressed flowers, both for themselves and for their friends. Writing letters occupied a significant part of women's day-to-day habits in 19th century Europe, and correspondents often slipped pressed specimens to communicate in the language of flowers, or floriography, including, for instance, red roses for someone they loved, yellow roses for a friend, forget-me-nots for someone who they didn't want to fall out of favor with, and so on. Women correspondents traded these pressings back and forth, building up, if not herbaria, although sometimes herbaria, small collections of dried plants that they might then arrange and put on display as works of art rather than as scientific specimens. As in this Quarantine Herbarium project, the products of these pressed flowers was often open-ended. Some carefully recorded their species names and ordered them taxonomically. Some never bothered to seek out their species names because they were using them for other purposes. Some practiced their illustration skills using them. Some just held on to them as things to do. For many women and other amateur collectors, though, working with plants expressed an act of piety, and the history of 19th century botany cannot be divorced from the changing entanglements of nature from religion that so characterized this century. Even though they were typically excluded from scientific societies that conferred professional status, some women, and indeed working class men, most often white, participated in exchange networks, both formal and informal. Historian of science Anne Secord has written about early 19th century British artisan botanists, many of whom worked for a living and attended mechanics institutes instead of universities, who met at public houses to debate intricacies of species designation for plants that they had collected in their local environments, sometimes splitting the cost of and sharing the expensive books and microscopes necessary to do real botanical work. Indeed, the 19th century ushered in an alternative to the colonial accounts of exotic species designed to communicate and sell the riches of empire. Local floras also proliferated, and botanical libraries are filled with taxonomic, sometimes very dry, works like Musci Britannici, or Pocketbook Herbarium of British Mosses, or the Flora Vectensis, being a systematic description of the phonogamous or flowering plants and ferns indigenous to the Isle of Wight. Some of these local flora were published under the names of professional botanists like Kew director William Jackson Hooker, but many of them were collaborative in nature and acknowledged contributions from a myriad of collectors whose biographies are difficult, if not impossible, to build out. These books, some of which left blank spaces for readers to collect and actually paste in their own specimens to build true local herbaria, thus guided amateur botanists through specific taxonomic processes, encouraging participatory natural history that didn't necessarily involve working for a garden, publishing, or even sending specimens out to some sort of centralized institution for processing. One incredibly successful exchange network that blurred the line between professional and amateur was co-founded in the US by Elizabeth Gertrude Knight Britton, a bryologist who helped to found the New York Botanical Garden. Britton was highly educated for a woman working in the 19th century, albeit in the second half of the 19th century, and she participated in scientific societies in a way that very few other women did. Raised on a sugar plantation in Cuba, Britton attended what's now Hunter College in New York and married another naturalist, the Columbia professor Nathaniel Lord Britton. Before meeting him, though, Britton published her botanical work with the support of the oldest botanical society in the US, the Tory Botanical Club, ultimately focusing her sights on mosses. Britton toed the line between the incredible scientific access that she was afforded and roles more typical for 19th century women, simultaneously contributing to major publications and managing Columbia's moss collections, and eventually helping to manage the NYBG unofficially and unpaid for most of her life. What's really interesting about Britton's case here, though, is how she facilitated these collecting networks. Publishing a series of short, easily accessible articles titled How to Study the Mosses in the early 1890s for the magazine The Observer, the bryologist invited contributions and exchanges of sets from and between amateur moth lovers across the US, writing, for instance, that Mr. Thomas Howell of Clackamas, Oregon, has sent us a small but very interesting collection of mosses from Yes Bay, Alaska. He writes that he can make from 20 to 30 sets of duplicates of the following species, which he offers for sale at $150 for the set, and this would have been circulated to all readers of The Observer. She praised another collector, Mr. R.S. Williams of Columbia Falls, Montana, for studying mosses, quote, so far away from all access to the larger herbaria and libraries, noting that much more long and patient work in the field would be necessary to eliminate duplicate and incorrect names for species, adding that she hoped, quote, these collectors and students would receive liberal support from American bryologists. And indeed, many of these so-called amateur societies, which were amateur only in the sense that they didn't necessarily require a university or graduate degree or elite social standing within a professional field, as in the case of the Linnaean Society of London, formed great networks of mutual support, enthusiasm, and rigorous scientific inquiry, and many of them have not just survived, but have grown to this day. The Tory Botanical Society, previously the Tory Botanical Club, for instance, invited members both from elite institutions on the East Coast and amateurs alike, usually functioning on a system of sponsorship and vetting members. For non-professionals, the Tory Botanical Society offered not just fellowship with other plant lovers and experts, but opportunities for publication within the club's bulletin, access to expensive instruments like microscopes and books, and organized meetings, field trips, and lectures that allowed them the space to debate and contribute to botanical science. And to be clear, there were hundreds of these clubs and societies across Europe, the US, and in colonial settings alike, all of them with a range of access, professionalism, and different goals in mind. What's worth noting, especially now though, is that while these networks did immense work in opening up the field to non-professionals, many of them working class and a select few of them women, they continue to exclude Black botanists, Indigenous botanists, and other people of color, all the while benefiting from their labor and expertise. As we've seen in such explicit relief over the last few months, what it means to be a Black birder, for instance, is radically different from what it means to be a white birder, even if both birders possess equal expertise, equipment, and dedication. Indeed, even when societies did open up their membership to people of color, which typically happened very slowly and without fanfare, it's almost always much easier to find the first woman member admitted to a society or club than the first Black man admitted to a society or club. Members of color remained and remain few and far between and have faced markedly different denials of access to knowledge production, particularly when that knowledge production is reliant on field work. when not just knowledge production, but also fellowship, camaraderie, and support is based in part on camping out in the forest with a group of white men, it's difficult to imagine how white women, people of color, and especially women of color, would ever feel safe, especially when, as many historians have demonstrated, the early 20th century environmental movement and the concept of the wilderness within the United States was explicitly racist and eugenicist. This leaves us in a bind, though, because professional botanical institutions like herbaria are built, as we've seen, on exclusionary and colonial foundations. To ask, say, an Indigenous botanist to contribute to a knowledge system that has quite purposely written Indigenous naming practices and environmental cosmologies out of its very fiber is dangerous. And recent calls to decolonize museums, gardens, and herbaria and other collections are simultaneously necessary and overdue, and on the other hand, incredibly challenging to put into place. And I'd be happy to talk more about what decolonizing some of these collections might actually look like. It's a very complicated question in the Q&A. But it's important to note that herbaria, like many other institutions, often hold vast numbers of specimens, and many of these spaces simply don't have the staff or resources to make these sorts of large-scale changes. They need, at the very least, serious governmental support in the US, which we currently lack, while moving away from the philanthropic funding systems that often place limitations on what institutions are allowed to say and do. Over the past couple of months, though, there's been an alternative or supplemental reaction to these institutional limitations through community building and awareness-raising movements, many of them taking place over social media. It's been so joyful and hopeful to see the hashtags Black in Nature and Black AF in STEM, and to see the overwhelming community of ornithologists come out for Black Birders Week, and more importantly, Black Botanists Week, which we are currently in the middle of. Watching Black botanists not just share stories of the challenges they faced, but also stories of their expertise, love for plants, and botanical legacies has been so unendingly necessary. And I'm heartened to see organizers, as you can see here, in the case of Dr. Tanisha M. Williams, welcome so-called amateurs, anyone who loves and lives with plants, into the space of radical inclusion. So just to conclude, you know, the herbarium, Quarantine Herbarium does not pretend to offer any solution or even solve these historic inequities. And it's apparent that working to better them will take not just time, but real structural change with serious money behind it. What I hope it does, though, is to provide an open-ended place for plant lovers to connect with one another and to explore the worlds around them anew, especially during this period of immense uncertainty, struggle, and grief. I hope, too, that the Quarantine Herbarium's manageable size might provide an opportunity for experimentation with new ways of ordering and interacting with nature. So what I've been showing here is version 1.0 of the project, which has largely just been a process of building connections and starting to amass specimens. But version 2.0, which I hope to roll out by the end of the summer on a new website, might propose alternative names for plants, acknowledge the indigenous land from which they were collected, include notes about their ethnobotanical uses over history, include alt text captioning and other means of making the objects legible and accessible to visually impaired and otherwise disabled contributors and readers, to propose new ways of arranging and ordering these plants, and to include short, accessible essays and resources contributed by writers, historians, botanists, gardeners, and other participants. While perhaps lofty in its goals, of course, I actually see the Quarantine Herbarium for me as a doable way of experimenting with new models of decolonization, classification, and curation, because the project is, at least hopefully, bounded in its scope and size by the length of the pandemic. When it will end, we don't really know, which can then inform the larger research that I do at existing institutions. It's an entirely different task, of course, to rethink ordering systems with 300 objects than it is for 6 million specimens. But this is maybe, for me, just a way of experimenting with what some of those alternatives might be and for really getting input on this from other contributors. So I'm going to end here, but I would like to end with a series of invitations. So first, of course, to contribute to the Quarantine Herbarium in whatever form you'd like. And current instructions are available in the project link on the Eventbrite page that you all visited. But I'd also like to invite you to think through in this Q&A period what a project like this might realistically do, and how or whether you think it can navigate between and across these overlapping systems of access or lack thereof, community and connection that I've proposed here today. Thank you.
Hi everyone, if you have any questions or comments, if you could just put them in the chat and I'll pass them along. And thank you for the great talk, Elaine.
I'm just seeing in the chat now that it seems like there were problems with audio. I hope that wasn't a big deal throughout the talk.
Yeah, I think that was just in the beginning.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't see chat while I was sharing my screen.
A lot of thank yous in the chat. I guess one question kind of go into more is, what do you think is the role for historians or other people in a certain field? In some, like, there's been a series of Black Birders Week and Black in Botany. I know that you've been active on Twitter about that. And what do you see kind of as your role or fellow historians' role or professionals' role?
So I think as a white historian, the question for me is quite different than it would be for a Black historian or you know, other person of color working within history who might find real community in these social media movements or settings. I would say that, you know, we spend most of our time unpacking this history, and the academic publishing process is incredibly slow, as so many people here I think know. And I think that for me, at least, some of these more accessible versions of community that have been taking place on Twitter give us an opportunity to communicate some of the research we've been doing for years on end that otherwise are completely inaccessible to the general public, for lack of a better term. So I think that it's not just an opportunity for us, but as I see it, a real responsibility to communicate our research to public-facing audiences and to make some of that more accessible. I would say that many institutions, historical institutions, archives, gardens, herbaria, have been incredibly good about digitizing their specimens and making them available to the general public. You know, it's a slow and expensive process that involves huge numbers of staff, but I think the more we can get the source material out there, the more sort of historical work that serves more people can be done.
Makes a lot of sense. We suddenly have a lot of questions. Thank you, everyone. First one is, can you comment on how an herbarium has been used to link different generations?
Yes, so many private herbaria, which might include smaller collections or bound books of collections, certainly have been held in family collections, right? So I know people who have found diaries or journals or just books of specimens that, you know, their great-grandparents have kept. It means that it's almost inevitably really difficult for historians to work with them if they're in private but not public collections. But I think they can be a really amazing way of forming some sort of intimate connection with people within your family who you otherwise might not know, right? I think flowers and seeing the amount of care and work that goes into pressing these plants gives a real feeling of intimacy, and I found it really incredibly moving to work with some of these specimens myself in real life and to handle them knowing that these people created them with such care and such patience and such time. And I would imagine that that would be so heightened for people within your family. Certainly I'm working with primarily historical collections, but you know, you can sort of define what you mean by across generations, whether it's your grandfather or whether it's, you know, somebody 300 years ago that you want to interact with.
Do you know if any of the herbariums have been used to extract DNA or germinate seeds?
So certainly herbaria are used for DNA extraction and experimentation. I actually just went to a talk a few weeks ago where somebody was doing that work at the New York Botanical Garden. And there are very precise but expensive ways of extracting tiny, tiny, tiny amounts of DNA that really don't cause much lasting damage to the herbarium specimen itself. This has been a pretty incredible way of tracking plant adaptation in the face of climate change, but also in retelling some historic stories. So in this particular talk that I went to, this team of specialists had been experimenting with tracking the blight that affected the Irish potato famine. So there are ways of tracking historical stories and discovering new insights into how plants have moved and changed and been wiped out over time that have real human stories behind them through DNA extraction. Absolutely.
Do you have suggestions for methods we can use in herbaria to uncover identities or stories of quote-unquote amateur collectors who weren't listed as contributors on labels, even though they may have helped with the collecting process?
Yeah, it's hard, right? And I would say that sometimes it's impossible. Maybe in the majority of cases, we will never be able to uncover these people. And it's been frustrating in some ways for me because even with years of sitting with some of these specimens, even if you uncover a name, it's a name like John Smith, and you can't really build a compelling biography with this very generic 19th century, very, very common name. Especially if that person doesn't have readily accessible archives or any archives at all. Certainly, spending a lot of time working with these specimens gives you insights into them. I know that one herbarium technician specialist at the New York Botanical Garden has uncovered a number of specimens that weren't directly named but can be attributed to the 19th century female botanist Ellen Hutchins based on handwriting recognition. And there are pretty incredible possibilities, I think, for what something like new digital tools like handwriting recognition programs might be able to get us. Sorry, the ice cream truck is directly in front of my house. So these new digital tools might sort of speed up that process. I don't think they're always perfect, and they certainly propose a number of challenges, including that the specimens would have to be digitized to begin with to be able to work with them in that way, which again is an incredibly expensive and lengthy process. But handwriting analysis is one of the sort of most immediate ways that comes to mind of identifying some of these people. And many 19th century botanists had pretty unique handwriting. So once you've worked with some of these letters for a few years, you might more readily be able to tell whether that herbarium specimen could indeed be his or hers.
I guess in eras when so much more was handwritten, you have a lot more to work with than nowadays where very little of the record would be handwritten.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Next question is, what are some 19th century women botanists who've inspired you?
Ooh. So I really do like Elizabeth Knight Burton at the New York Botanical Garden because she is a moss specialist, and as some of you might know, I love moss and am working on a manuscript on moss, and they have sort of been my subject of study since before I wrote my dissertation. They really got me into the field of history of botany in general. So because she was such a specialist and because she kept very careful notes, which of course, eases the process, she, I think, is my all-time favorite. But again, I'm sort of wary of these sort of individual stories of like women who persisted, right? And like they need to be told, but I'm not sure that that's the type of history that I'm necessarily interested in doing, because again, it privileges this narrative of a single woman who made it despite the odds. And while those stories are very true and real and necessary and still very much in play, I think that it does really obscure the hundreds and hundreds of other women who were involved in the process, many of them who had very complicated, problematic politics, who shouldn't be celebrated because they were women who succeeded, but should be thought of as complex, potentially problematic individuals in their own rights, many of whom benefited from the colonial process in the 19th century. And of course, there are hundreds of other women who did the same thing who we will never be able to recover.
Sort of along those lines, what about ethnobotanists? I would think that this group would include a greater number of non-white folks than other quote, types of botanists, or at least white ethnobotanists would acknowledge the contributions of various, quote, native plant collectors?
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent. Ethnobotany as sort of a defined field, so somebody who might be a professional ethnobotanist probably didn't emerge until the 20th century. Certainly people were doing ethnobotanical work mixed into their other botanical work in the 19th century who didn't at all necessarily record names, or certainly weren't people of color. And these are many of the sort of famous explorers who focused much of their work on the ethnobotanical uses of plants, but wrote about the people who use these plants in incredibly derogatory terms in many, many cases. Certainly there are many great ethnobotanists and ethnobotanists of color working now at most major institutions. And some of these people have been doing incredible work in working with local communities across the world to repatriate specimens, to improve knowledge databases, to improve you know, our understandings of how these plants have been used historically, but they are certainly not acting in that way in the 19th century.
How do you see the labor of the project continuing? Do you have the capacity to continue into phase 2 and build upon it?
It's a great question. Yeah, so ideally this project would be bounded, right? So because it's a quarantine herbarium, it's supposed to sort of be restricted by the bounds of quarantine. We were just talking about this before the talk, but it's feeling increasingly uncertain of what those boundaries might be and whether the quarantine is sort of going to fizzle out or whether there's going to be some sort of resurgence because nobody's wearing their masks anymore. So the sort of temporal length of it does concern me within the broader conversation of how long the quarantine is, which concerns me. The labor has certainly been in some ways much, much higher than I ever would have expected. I thought that this was going to be a project between me and a few friends, ideally, and it has ballooned to something I really couldn't have foreseen. I certainly, for building the website, I will hire someone to do that and hire someone who specializes in building accessible, sustainable websites that I could only sort of, you know, feel around in the dark for. And ideally, I would hire people on top of that, 1 or 2 other people who could help with this project. Of course, that depends on funding and that depends on the length of the quarantine. So if this is only going to happen for another 6 weeks, is it worth hiring another person to help out with this? I don't know. So it's feeling a little bit like murky territory right now. Certainly I want these to go onto a sustainable website, whether or not this continues beyond the bounds of the summer, which has been my sort of framing end for now, even though it seems very clear that the pandemic will last well past the summer. But I would certainly welcome suggestions on that. And yeah, the labor has been much, much more than I ever would have expected.
Mm-hmm. I guess like many things, it's murky
Yeah.
how to lay out the timeline. And this is going back into the broad picture of plants, when did weeds get labeled as such and why?
I don't know that I have a good question or a good answer for that. So certainly weeds, as I think we all know, is sort of a generic term for any plant that's growing where we don't want it to grow. So there's no sort of formal definition of what a weed is that isn't sort of a matter of subjectivity. I've seen the word weed in the 19th century and certainly in the 18th century too, typically in relation to plants that we would consider very fertile herbs like mint or dill, which, you know, as most gardeners know, you might plant once and it'll keep popping up year after year and take up your entire garden. So I've seen many references to plants that we might consider traditionally weedy in that they sort of grow all over the place, whether we want them to or not. I think a botanist might be able to better answer this question, and I know there are a few on the call today.
Yeah, feel free to give a brief, if possible, explanation, any botanists in the audience, in the chat room. It was hi from Q. It's interesting that you found photos are the way to exchange. Herbaria are doing the same, huge scale digitization, often with direct access to high-res images with free use. Do you have any thoughts on the possibilities or limitations of these huge digital collections?
Yeah, I should mention that Mark Nesbitt asking this question is doing incredible work in the collection of economic botany at Kew, doing some incredibly inspiring projects that reach across the sciences and into the arts and humanities that I think are just signal the best possible way of unpacking some of these collections, and certainly should be used as a model for other botanical gardens going forward. I think that a digital specialist might be able to answer some of these large-scale storage issues, which I think is a real issue with digital herbaria. I think, as you know, as many people know, digitizing millions of specimens takes a ton of money and a ton of staff members. And realistically, especially in what's turning into a complete economic crisis, it's unclear of what, realistically, what gardens might be able to do with that. I do think that one of the issues that has been on my mind about digitizing specimens, for all of their incredible possibilities, is that in some ways it's replicating some of the colonial violence that was sort of written into their very collection, right? So I've seen herbarium specimens that replicate place names that were given to these plants that are extremely out of touch and were, falsely recorded in the 19th century. So some of the metadata that is attached to these specimens, I think, can be incredibly limiting. And there's a real question of whether digitization without extra work put on top of it serves to replicate and make more freely accessible and available some of the really problematic metadata that was inextricable from the specimens in the first place. But there's certainly institutions who've been doing incredible work with this. And I know that JSTOR Global Plants has done across the board a fairly good job in including synonyms for plants and more recent updated place names alongside those specimens. Yeah, I think, adding summaries of the plants can be really, really helpful. It can give us huge amounts of data to work with, but it does run the risk of replicating some of the violence that was sort of written into these specimens to begin with. But it's an interesting question in terms of repatriation, right? So if we are arguing that plants should be repatriated, which some would say yes, some would say no, having digital copies, excellent digitizations makes that process, I think, much easier and gives us copies that we would still be able to work from regardless of where the plants go.
Even from my very limited experience working with some of the Wagner's book, like 19th century books on botany, just paging through and being like, okay, what's this place called now? Or like, what was it called before this book was written? And what's this plant called? And the people identified as, living near the plant, what did they call themselves? And, even just like interpreting one page about a flower requires a lot of context and research. That
it takes a lot of context and research, and it takes a lot of work, right? So I think it's so necessary for historians of science to do this work, and for people at botanical gardens to do this, to be trained in this sort of historical, anthropological in some ways work. But it takes money and it takes time and resources. And I'm concerned about what's going to happen to some of these incredible efforts as institutions lose funding in this economic crisis.
On a lighter note, do you know if there are any amateur botanist groups that exchange pressed flowers?
I know of people who do it amongst their sort of friends and families. I would maybe reach out to in a club or society, even the Tory Botanical Club, to see if you could make those connections. A lot of times these sorts of exchange groups are really about personal connections and forming these connections. I do think that there is a real risk of transmitting invasive species unintentionally with these sorts of physical exchange networks. So I would want to sort of go through people who really know the science behind that to see what they say about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I've heard people talk about how the literal presentation of a specimen on a blank page adds to the perception of them as, quote, outside of their historical context. Would you ever consider including visuals that include more than just the plant and try to provide the societal context?
Absolutely. I think that is a really excellent suggestion for one way forward of dealing with these sorts of decontextualizations of plants. And certainly historians of science, including Daniel Bleichmar, have written about how removing the plant from its sort of context then makes it seem extractable, collectible, and transferable across places, right? It sort of removes any sort of ecological grounding for that plant. So certainly that's an excellent idea of how we might broaden this project and raise new interesting questions about contextualization. It's hard for me to envision what that might look like. Maybe, you know, illustration is an excellent way to do it. I certainly don't have artistic skills, so maybe somebody else could do this in a better way than I ever could, but I would really welcome practical suggestions of how that might work, because it actually really is a very serious turning point in the history of botanical illustration and collection. That surrounding a plant by white removes it from its oftentimes indigenous context. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and browsing the herbarium, like, it seems like some people are experimenting with that, and some of them are really interesting, even if it was just their own personal notes of they were walking the dog and this is what the weather was like, which is, you know, more superficial, and I think this question was asking, but it definitely illustrated better than just a plant.
Yeah, I think that adding some context to the specimen, even if it's textual, does actually do quite a great deal. And this is, you know, this has been primary to my sort of diary purposes of keeping these plants. It's highly personal. You know, it's like giving some context for when and where I collected it so that I can look back and remember that moment, like, oh, this is the day that I left Madison, Wisconsin, and it was really sad and really exciting. Like, evoking those emotions by taking more notes on it, I think, can be really, really helpful. I also do really like people that have illustrated directly on the page, just as providing some alternative, including when those illustrations are provided by children. So I highly encourage these sorts of annotations.
Looks like, I think that's all the questions. We've gotten some very interesting comments. So anyone who hasn't been looking at the chat, some interesting thoughts in there. And if no one has any more questions, I guess we'll end here, and thank you for this great talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for joining us, and we'll be glad to have you back. We love following your work, and hope we can actually have you at the Wagner again in the not too distant future.